Hi, hello. Just a reminder that we're halfway through the 9-point issue 2 Kickstarter, and honestly, we're actually a little bit behind on funding for our goal. We still have about $1,000 before we hit the halfway point funding-wise. So if you would share the Kickstarter around with your friends, or if you could think about pledging, that would mean so much to us. 9-Point is a comic about cat nights. It is full of characters that are all Canadian wildlife besides the cats. And it's a fantasy story, kind of inspired by Legend of Zelda and Gurren Lagann. And we are trying really hard to print the second issue this fall. So please think about sharing it around or supporting it. It means a lot. Thank you for listening to this ad. Onto the video. So, for 9-Point, I am doing a lineless style for the comic. Part of my reasoning behind deciding on this was to create a style where I can use color, but I wanted to cut out the inking stage to lighten my workload a little bit. There you go, we took out the inking step. It's one less thing for me to do because comics take forever, and my dogs are running at me. Hello? But yeah, comics take forever, and if I can cut out a step, that's the best, because there's so many pages I have to do. Oh my god. So instead of inking, then flatting, then doing all my shading and shadows and highlights and stuff, I just have to pencil, and then I color. That's it. In theory, it's faster. And it kind of is, sometimes, depending on the page or panel, because using a lineless art style has its own kind of trials and tribulations to it, and its own kind of learning curve. However, it is something that has really helped me improve on my shapes and my color knowledge and color use. And the reason that is because I can't rely on my line art to carry things, which I've done in the past with my my very line-heavy inked comics. So if you're thinking about doing a lineless style, possibly for your comic, maybe for the reasons I outlined, maybe just because you like the look, which is also a-okay, here are some things I learned while creating 9-Point's lineless style about how to do it and how to do it easier. So, my process, you might have seen a little bit if you've been watching along with these videos, but my process is I put down my pencils, so my sketches, kind of figuring out what everything is, where it is, basically putting down the whole page onto the page without any color. So it looks basically like line art when I sketch things out, though it's a little bit more sketchy and drafty than that, and I use a lot of construction lines. But I basically put down all my sketches, and then I lower the opacity and I figure out the shapes underneath that. Now, getting into this, I've already done some videos about coloring, and I plan out all my colors when I'm doing my thumbnails of my comics. So what's nice is when I sit down to fill in all the shapes underneath my sketches, I already have the colors picked out and I know where they're going, and so it's really easy to just kind of fill in my shapes. And honestly, I find it in the past when doing flat colors, which is when you put your base color underneath your line art, and kind of fill in everything to then shade on top. I used to find that process so boring, whereas I find when I'm doing a lineless style, it feels a lot more like inking, which I find much more engaging, because the sketch on top isn't exact. Sometimes it's sketchy, or the proportions might be a little bit off, or it's not super solidified, again, because it's just a sketch. Whereas when I'm putting down my shapes, I guess my flat colors, in this case, when I'm putting down my shapes, that's when I'm doing my inking. That's when I'm solidifying my forms and figuring out how everything is actually shaped and kind of planning out where I'm going to put my shading on top instead of just kind of coloring in the lines as flat coloring used to feel for me. So yeah, it's a lot more engaging. So then once I have all my shapes down, I take away the sketch on top. I'll turn the opacity off on all that. And I'll start to kind of figure out, I guess I start to solidify the shapes even more from there, usually because there'll be gaps that I miss just because the sketch was covering pieces. So I usually sit down and figure that out, make it look nice without having the guidelines on top. But I do keep my pencils around for if I need to look back at them in case maybe there's something I missed, or maybe I really liked how I rendered it in the pencils and I want to make sure that I capture that again. So don't throw away your pencils once you put down your shapes. So yeah, so keep it around. And from there, when I'm doing my shading and my rendering, because for 9 point I wanted it to have a bit more of like a 3D feel to it instead of it being flat. But I'm trying to limit it to 2 to 3 value shifts throughout. So maybe 2 values darker and maybe like 1 lighter value for highlights and stuff if it's needed. So I'm trying not to go too crazy. I went a little crazy on the first few pages of this issue, and I'm gonna have to go back and redo those. Basically, I'm trying to save myself a little time by limiting how much rendering I'm doing on top of everything. And once I've got all my, my shadows and my highlights down, that's when I start to really refine things and make sure my lighting is correct, though that usually happens when I'm putting in my shadows and highlights and stuff. And I put in my textures. So in 9 point, there's a lot of fur textures because the characters are all furries and animals and they have fur, so there's lots of that. So, if I need to make something really shiny and reflective, then I work on that, etc. And my final step is I add lines back in where I need them. So for example, I tend to line my character's eyes, kind of anime style. I mean, it implies like lashes and stuff, but also put lines maybe for, to suggest kind of where their snout is, because their snout is very 3D and sometimes a line can really help define that kind of volume, I guess, to it. And then, of course, adding in, if they have like the little whisker dots on their nose, or if they have like, if their lips are darker and need to be outlined or something, because like a lot of dogs and cats have that. And I'll put in little details, embroidery on cloth and stuff like that. Just wherever a line is needed, I'll put it back in, but I don't line absolutely everything, because that would be the opposite of what I need. But sometimes you need a line, and that's okay. So there you go. That's my process so far. I'm still refining it because this is still kind of a new style for me, but I'm sure these principles kind of apply to everything as well. So while I'm still new to this, there's lots of things that I always try to keep in mind when I'm working on this. And these are kind of universal concepts, you should be applying these even when you're doing line art or really line heavy work. But here are some really important things to remember, and they're especially important when you're doing a lineless style because you can't rely on your lines to imply all this stuff. So number 1, make sure that you have really clear silhouettes. So like I said, you can't rely on your lines to differentiate things. If you have, the arms overlapping with the torso of your character, it might be hard to parse where their arms are. Whereas if you have them more to the side, where you can clearly see kind of like if you filled in the character with all black or something, or one color, you could still tell kind of what they were doing because the silhouette is really nice and clear. You should be focusing on doing that with your in your lineless style. And like I said, you should be doing this even when you're doing a line art style. But it's really important to help your reader understand what things are at a glance, because I don't know, sometimes you might not get your values right and things can get muddled together. But if you have a nice strong silhouette, people are going to look at it and being like, oh, okay, I understand how this character is posed or what he's holding or what that object is, because it's got a really clear outline. Whatever. I mean, without actually having a physical outline, but you know what I mean, right? Number 2, make sure that you have really strong contrast. So your silhouette will help you if your contrast isn't up to par when you start, but it gets even better when you add really nice high contrast. People were laughing at me and Bones in the last critique stream we did because we kept telling people work on your contrast, heighten your contrast, make your contrast better. But it's so important. My art teacher used to scream that at us whenever we were working with really mid-tones or stuff that was all the same value pretty much, and never pushing it so that it looked, so our shadows were really dark and our highlights were really light. Everything just kind of sat in the middle of the value range. It was all really gray and there was no contrast and you couldn't tell anything. It was all very boring. But our teacher told us that a lot because it's a really important part of making your art stand out and look real nice. And again, it's really important with a lineless style because the only thing you're relying on to differentiate different objects and backgrounds and even different parts of your character is just understanding that there's value shifts between the colors of them compared to the stuff around them. You don't have this nice black line between things to differentiate a character's outline compared to the background. So, you gotta make sure that the values of your colors are really nice and contrasty and really, easy to differentiate. Heighten that contrast. So what I recommend is, I think a lot of people, our default is to be kind of mid-tone. Maybe not even mid-tone. It might just be like, our instinct is to not go very far in value, like not do high contrast. Like I know for me, when I was first starting out, I always thought it looked really ugly when I added like really dark values in. I wanted to keep everything very like pastel and light. But honestly, you really got to push yourself to do that. So if you're someone where all your values are really dark, you need to put in some really light highlights in there. Or if you're someone like me who had like really light palettes all the time, you need to add some really nice dark colors in there. Make those shadows darker, make those highlights lighter, and just keep pushing it until you can't handle it anymore. And over time, you'll just get more and more used to adding lots of high contrast to stuff. Number 3, make sure you are modeling your forms. Again, you definitely need to do this when you're inking. But for me, when I'm inking, I find it really easy to show form because I can use my lines, I can outline things to show kind of what their shape is. And I can use, say, like hatching lines to imply a 3D form to something. But with a lineless style, I had to really force myself to focus on my shading to tell all of this information. Which really taught me about kind of where to place shadows, and even with contrast and value stuff, it really taught me a lot on how to make those forms look like they're 3D and real, even though it's a 2D space, which sounds really daunting, but it's really easy. What I did was I went and grabbed a bunch of references of what actual, like say animal faces, because I'm drawing lots of animals, and I looked at where the shadows were and where the highlights were on their face, and I started to mimic that. And just make sure that you are, it gets easier the more you practice it, but right now I'm like, just perfectly render 3D space. But basically when you are drawing something, try to think about it in 3D as much as you can and use reference to really help you. It's really important to try and think of your stuff in 3D and imply its shape, just because it can add a little bit of realness to it, and it can make things easier to render when you kind of understand what things look like if they were 3D. And this is kind of the reason why I encourage people to draw their characters in turnarounds, where you show like the front of your character, the side of your character, and the back of your character, so you start to understand what they look like in 3D space, so that no matter which way your character turns, you can still draw them correctly. And part of that is really modeling their forms using your shading in lineless style. Or it can even just be like from the shape of the shape. Like, is it an organic shape? Is it a geometric shape? How does it look when you flip it? Etc. Thinking about all that stuff. And contrast also plays a part in it, so make sure you're paying attention to all that stuff. It's hard, but it's very important fundamental stuff. And the more you practice it and the more you keep it in mind, the better your nice lineless style will look. And like I said, you really gotta understand these things and really lean on them, because otherwise your art may be hard to understand when you can't rely on line art to carry lots of stuff. As I had to learn when I switched from doing a very line-heavy comic to a no-line comic. So I hope all this has been useful and not super confusing. I love doing line art, so this has been a little hard. So my other comic, Magpie, is very line art heavy, and it's only in black and white, which I kind of miss. I really like doing that style. I love doing line work. But at the same time, I have learned so much by doing this lineless style. It taught me kind of how to render my forms and how to improve my color knowledge a lot, like I said before. So I'm very grateful that I'm doing this, and it's helping me improve a lot as an artist. So I guess I encourage you guys to do it. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can also do line art. And the thing is, there's so many different styles of like lineless art. You don't have to utilize like 3D rendering like I'm kind of trying to do with 9 point. You can make it super flat. You can use very few shadows. You can only rely on, say, like relying on color instead of relying on like shading. Like in the past, Bones and I have played around with comics where we don't use any shading, it's just flats. You can also do partly line stuff where you don't line every single thing. You can use values on one part and lines on another part. There's so much you can do with comics. But I guess if you're sitting here trying to decide what you want to do, I'd recommend doing lots of experimentation before you start your comic and figure out how you want it to look. For example, when I was deciding on 9 point style, I grabbed a ton of references from artists I really liked who did really nice, like, really beautiful colors or really nice, like, lineless stuff or really nicely rendered stuff. For example, I looked a lot at Cucumber Quest, and I looked at Scurry a lot, another webcomic. So yeah, just look at artists you like. See if you can do what they're doing, just to try it out. Of course, adding your own flair onto it and making it your own. But yeah, just experiment. Put together some mood boards or some Pinterest boards or something, and just play around with it until you have something you like. And hopefully, it's something that's, you know, light on the workload and easy to replicate. As I'm hoping this 9-point style will be. I mean, I did 1 issue of it, so here's hoping I can finish issue 2. Anyways. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to me ramble. Make sure you boop that little subscribe button if you're new here, because we've got so many more videos about comics. There's a whole bunch on the channel. There's a whole bunch always coming out. So make sure you stick around and watch those, I guess. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening. I'm sleepy. Goodbye.